Democrats cut funding to Dolly Parton's Imagination Library in Washington state. Do we care? Let's talk about it in our segment, Unbelievable. Boop. Okay, so of course the state budget thing was a whole ordeal, and Democrats cut in places that seemed really insignificant so they can continue to fund their ideological desires and all of that. So one of the things that apparently got cut is funding for Dolly Parton's Imagination Library in Washington state. She has these all over the country. So Imagination Library put out a statement. It says the final 2025-2027 operating budget for Washington state was released on April 26. Despite earlier commitments made from the state in 2022, funding to expand the Imagination Library of Washington was not included in the final budget, which could impact over 121,000 children currently enrolled in the program. Look, books for kids, access to books for kids, love it. Dolly Parton, love her. Does she need taxpayer money to do this? Absolutely not. This is one of those, and look, when I first saw this, and Nicole and I were kind of talking about this issue, because there's some other things that were cut that we're looking into, that on its face, when I first saw it, I was like, that's annoying, because why? They're still funding laser hair removal for transgender inmates. So instead of funding books for kids, they're funding laser hair removal for transgender inmates. So that tells you the priorities of the Democratic Party. So yeah, I do have an issue with that. I think they have a lot of misguided priorities. At the same time, similar to how I feel about laser hair removal for transgender inmates, the government doesn't need to pay for it. And you can find a long list of private entities, of nonprofits that would be more than happy to step in and fill the gap. I mean, we talked about it with, the budget line items for youth hockey, for underprivileged kids in Seattle. That's awesome. It was for immigrants. Immigrants coming to our country, learning about, a sport we love in the Pacific Northwest. That's awesome. But you make one phone call to the Kraken and the Kraken will step in. It was like a $100,000 line item. You don't think the Kraken would fund that? Just because something feels good and is maybe good doesn't mean that taxpayers have to be the ones to foot the bill for it. In the case of the Imagination Library, they have a ton of corporate sponsors here in Washington state that I'm sure would be more than happy to cover the gap. So they have, the Puyallup Tribe of Indians, the Washington State Fair, Rain FC, the Cowlitz Indian Tribe, United Way. And of course, they have money from the State Department of Children, Youth, and Families and the Washington Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction. So they're losing some of their state funds for expansion. But you're telling me someone as beloved as Dolly Parton doing something as good as the Imagination Library isn't something in a state like ours that we have the private funds to prop up? I think we do. We are a wealthy state. We have wealthy people here who are incredibly, and have always been, incredibly generous with their money and their donations. So you make a couple well-placed phone calls and you fill the gap. And I'm sure that they'll ultimately end up doing that, but it's just this, and I guess I know Dolly Parton didn't put out this woe is me statement, but to me it's sort of like, why do you think we should have to pay for that? Why do you think we should have to pay for hockey lessons for immigrant kids? Or laser hair removal for transgender inmates? Or Imagination Library run by Dolly Parton? Some of those things are great, love them, awesome, but that's the difference, I think, between the people that think like us and progressives and radical socialists, which is we don't believe the government exists to pay for people's wants. And they do. That's why we found ourselves in a massive, $15 billion budget deficit. If you went through the budget and you cut out the wants and you just left the needs must have, we'd probably have a $20 billion surplus. Because you go in there with a fine-tooth comb, and even like Bob Ferguson, he says he put all this work into the budget to really dig into it and cut out what he'd come up with, $7 billion or something like that in cuts. But then he comes out, no, I'm not cutting the Office of Equity. No, I'm not cutting these things that are just wants, not needs. So there's a ton of wants in the budget. I'm sorry, Dolly Parton, I'll even make a donation. I will go today and make a donation to the Washington Imagination Library. I think it's a great program, but I should have a choice to make that donation with my money as opposed to the government making that donation for me by force.